Okay, yeah, what I'm going to do over the next hour really is just give you a case study, I suppose, of a project, and importantly what thus far we think we got out of it. We're obviously still playing around with the data. I'll explain why in a few minutes. The aims of this research, both myself and Basil work with a group of MA students, mainly international. There's a group of 26 this year, of which only one is British. The only, I think, out of the 26, the only native speaker. And therefore what we wanted to do was to really begin to try to understand and help students begin to enculturate into an English academic environment more quickly, really by just sort of analysing our own teaching and their learning. So the initial aims of the research that got us the grant were these really, to begin to try and enhance the quality of their learning, through the quality of our learning through collaboration in lesson study, to actually use that as a vehicle for improving their learning opportunities, and to really think quite deeply about the kind of learning opportunities that we were giving students. And at a, suppose, sort of more of a meta level, as a result of those two things, trying to evaluate lesson study as a vehicle for our own development, for our own professional development, maybe, and whether or not it was giving us something useful. And the sort of initial ideas that we started off on, before we actually had our first meeting last September, I spent some of the summer just beginning to trawl through some of the research about international students and learning and international students learning within an English British context. And therefore our initial ideas really was this notion of understanding, certainly anecdotally from our own students, that for some of them learning is actually quite difficult to begin with because it doesn't operate in a way that they're used to. That actually a lot of the rules that we think of as innate good teaching and learning are rules that just don't, in a sense, don't apply in some ways. And also within the literature, or some of the literature, there's this idea of both cultural difference, which we would actually question quite fundamentally. So you get a lot in the literature, for example, about Confucian heritage learners, which we think doesn't really exist. Certainly from our experience. Would you agree? I mean, really, it's a massive oversimplification. But there is very clearly an issue in there about language acquisition. And obviously, within any subject, but certainly within education, I'll use an example later on from neuroscience, where you've got a huge amount of technical vocabulary that actually a lot of native speakers would probably struggle with, never mind people who are coming to it for the first time. And therefore what we did, very, very much initially, we did come at this from a consideration of culture and learning. But in our first meeting, after about half an hour of discussion, the first meeting we had lasted about an hour and a half, where we were just literally struggling, if you like, to find a focus, to find a way forward from what seemed like really quite a number of issues. Vassal sort of summed it up wonderfully. There's a little quote in here from him. What we're now saying to them is that they're at the threshold of a new community, new community of learning. And this kind of tack that we took right from the start was that it isn't about us trying to inculcate these people into an English learning community. There's elements of that because they have to be able to write essays in particular ways and so on. But actually what we were trying to do was get them to create their own unique learning community. And that actually wasn't about 25 students bridging the gap over to the one British student in the group. It was actually about them as a group creating their own learning community and working in different ways. So that, in a sense, some of those sort of what seem to be some of those underpinnings about the way that international students come into, say, master's level education were almost being sort of avoided from the start. We were trying to build something in some ways quite different. Very early on as well, in that same meeting, and it's something that we've talked a lot about before, was that, well, okay, then if we're going to create a learning community, if this thing is about learning, what is learning? And I suppose in all fairness, the simple answer to that is that you can't define it, because actually it's so complex, it operates in different ways in different contexts. But we're sort of, well, I'm certainly very keen on the work of Knudy Lerius. I know that Vassal likes it as well. What Knudy Lerius, he's a Danish psychologist. And what he argues essentially is that there are 3 dimensions to learning. The book that he wrote in 2007 is simply called How We Learn. And in my opinion, it's probably the best single volume work on learning that I've ever read. What he comes up with actually is a synthesis. His model of learning, if you like, is actually one that is built out of an engagement with an incredibly wide selection of literature, all the way from neuroscience all the way through sort of cultural, social, you know, very, very widely read individual who's created this synthesis. And at base level, what he argues is that if we take the individual to begin with, there are 2 dimensions to learning. There's the cognitive, so if you like the neuroscience part of it, memory, he talks about Piaget quite a lot and different types of individual learning. He also talks about the biological, and does actually sort of say that whilst it isn't necessarily explicit in day-to-day learning, nevertheless it's there. There's an evolutionary element to learning that we mustn't forget about. But he argues that there's this sort of cognitive side, but that the other side is that around mental balance and emotion. And he talks about the idea that you have to give sort of mental energy over to learning. That actually if you don't give mental energy over to learning, it won't happen. So you've got to be motivated. You've got to be enthusiastic to make learning happen really well. If you aren't motivated, if you're not willing to give over that sort of mental energy, then actually you're not going to learn a lot. And as a result, I think there's a real message in there that I think as teachers we forget, that you can't force people to learn. You know, you can teach however much you want. You can teach in lots of different ways. You can really lay it out in fantastically positive terms. But if somebody doesn't want to learn something, you're not going to force them. It's impossible. And what he argues is that if you take those 2 dimensions together, so the emotional and the cognitive, that's where you have acquisition, and an acquisition of new information and knowledge and meaning. But then he also obviously brings in this idea of the social and argues that actually the vast majority, if not all learning, has that sort of interactive element to it. So he would argue, for example, that reading a book is social learning. Because actually what you're doing is you're engaging with somebody else's ideas and the kind of arguments that they're making. It may be asynchronous, they may not be in the room with you, but you are actually involved in a form of social learning. And therefore what he does is he argues that actually to get really fantastic learning, to get learning that works and is embedded in a way of thinking about learning, is to see those 3 different dimensions. I haven't got a copy here. He does a wonderful diagram, I think it's in the book, where he actually plots on about 50 different learning theorists onto that field as to sort of where they are in relation to those 3 dimensions. So sort of Piaget sort of right up in the left-hand corner, Rogers I think is sort of somewhere, and Wenger is right in the middle. So
where's Bloom in that? Because he talks about cognition and affective.
I seem to remember certainly on that model he doesn't use Bloom. He doesn't use Bloom a great deal.
Interesting, because he uses all 3 aspects.
But he certainly doesn't really use him a lot in his research. He's not really on his radar. And therefore what we did was that we took this as a basic model for learning. You know, Vassal sort of said before we stopped for coffee that in a lot of lesson study, learning is very implicit. People don't discuss what they mean by learning and the processes within learning. So we wanted to sort of get this sort of in place right from the word go. And this has informed the way that we've tried to collect data. And this is just a sort of this was what we did to begin with. What we decided was that we would use Ilerus's model and try to collect data that would give us some kind of insight into all the three different dimensions. So we chucked everything bar the kitchen sink at it to begin with, just to see what different methods were giving us. Found out very quickly that it's totally unsustainable. That you're collecting so much data that you just get confused of what you've got, where it is, and certainly you're never going to get the opportunity to analyse it all. I mean, you know, to give you just an insight into how much is getting. I mean, if you really are in a position where you're thinking, I need to produce papers, you know, I need to get into research that gives me data and papers, lesson study gives you data in shed loads. We've done 3 cycles. In other words, 6 lessons for this project. Just the first cycle of 2 sessions, once you put all of the transcripts together, the transcripts total 65,000 words. So it just gives you vast quantities of data. I would have quite said it's unmanageable, but we could, I think with that and the other project we're doing this year, we could probably quite happily not do any primary research now for about the next 5 years, and we would still probably not have enough time to really in-depth analyse everything we've got. To give you some idea of what we tried to do and how we sort of saw it linking into Ilerus's 3 dimensions. We audio recorded all the meetings so that we could get them transcribed, but to begin with, what we also did was to video record them. And actually the reason for videoing them was to sort of see whether or not, for example, was our body language giving anything away in terms of, if you like, the emotional side of our learning in those discussions. How were we actually engaging with one another? Was there anything in there that might just give us something interesting? Obviously saving all the papers that will come into those. What we've also done, we haven't analysed them yet, is to actually keep a notebook for all of those meetings and for all the work that we're doing on lesson studies, so that at the end of the project, one of the things that we might be able to do is look at those notebooks and actually sort of say, are there any patterns in what we're putting down? And also importantly, if we look at, say, the same meeting that we've both been in, where we've been discussing things with each other, how different are the notebooks? What are we noting down? Why are we noting different things down, or the same things down? What are we taking differently from those particular meetings? And then obviously the sort of saved, the saved outputs, things like the plans that we've created and any resources. The lesson, very similar, videoing them, obviously the observation notes, but then one of the things that we have done, we haven't really analysed them yet because we haven't had time so far, but what we were doing was putting dictaphones on the tables where students were working to try and pick up social talk and to try and understand how they were learning through social interaction. The official outputs again, but really importantly, samples of student notes. And where that's been important actually is student interviews focusing on learning. And what we've actually done, I think, actually quite successfully, is we've used stimulated recall interviews. So what we've done is we've asked students to bring along the notes, that any piece of paper that they've written on during a lesson, to bring it with them, talk to them generally about the lesson and what they got from it and what they liked and what they felt they learned, but then actually begin to talk to them in quite a lot of detail about, well, you know, look, you've highlighted those things there, can you remember why? You know, you put some notes down there, can you remember why? And it's really interesting, not only from their stimulated recall, but then also actually relating that and the differences in what they've written to what you've observed in the session. So that you're beginning to sort of get a more extensive triangulation of different data channels to understand, you know, are my observations accurate? And I'll speak about that in a bit, because they haven't always been. What we also did, and it never really got off the ground, I think partly because both us when we were teaching and when we were observing, we were a bit knackered anyway, and it happened in the afternoon and the students were coming to go. We did have a bit of a go, just the two of us, before we discussed with one another how we thought the session had gone. We would actually go away with a dictaphone, literally for 5 or 10 minutes, give almost a very quick, emotive, whilst we're in the moment still, review of how we thought the session had gone, both as observer and as teacher, wondering to a certain extent whether or not what we say just after the session, when you're still in that sort of post-session high, is very different to then the kind of evaluation meeting that you might have 2 days later. And is there any kind of difference in the tenor of what you're saying between those two periods? Because obviously you have that reflective period in between. Just again to sort of see whether or not that gives you anything from the emotive side of our own learning. And then with the evaluation meetings, again, video recording the meetings, audio recording them, and then saving papers, etc. So you get a very, very rich stream of data. And having looked through that data, obviously the planning and the evaluation meetings are really important. They give us a lot about our thinking and how we develop things, and how actually, even though we had a very clear set of stated aims at the start of the project, how those have actually just gone off at tangents, and we've ended up with somewhere very different to where we intended at the start of the process. The kind of insights we've got, the kind of things we've done are very, very different. But I think the really rich data is certainly within the observation, but mostly within those post-session student interviews. We have really started to get a lot of very, very useful and important information from those, supplemented by sort of co-constructing sessions, which I'll talk about in a little while. So this is sort of, if you're doing absolutely everything, we've stripped some of this out. We didn't carry on with the post-session recording after the first cycle. We just had to throttle back a bit because we just found that we were collecting so much, and logistically and almost mentally we were finding it really quite difficult to keep that level of data collection going. Would you agree? I mean, it's just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. So, what did we look at? We went through 3 cycles in the end. We only got funded for 2. But we decided to keep a 3rd cycle on because we were enjoying it. We felt we were getting a lot from it. What I would say is, as a result, we've been through 6 sessions. We certainly wouldn't want to do more than that in a year. I mean, by the time we got to the end of March and we got to the end of the 6th session, while we were really happy with what we'd got, we were actually quite happy that it was stopping. Because it does, A, take up a lot of time, and B, it really is mentally challenging. You know, having those discussions at that level on a regular basis, working with students is, I mean, it's certainly not stressful, but it does actually take its toll because you are thinking very, very deeply. The first cycle, what we ended up doing, the 2 sessions that we ran, I taught a session on learning theories and Vasil taught a session on effective teaching. And the sort of focus that emerged out of our discussions for that was a focus really on trying to understand students' preferences, given that they're coming from a whole series of different starting points for active or didactic approaches to learning. Because actually some of them, as I'll sort of show a little bit in a while, really weren't sure about active learning. You know, they felt that it was our job and it was their position they felt most comfortable if they could just sit with PowerPoint slides and some notes and we would just talk at them for 2 hours. And anything other than that, it was almost a case of, well, I'm not learning enough, or I'm not learning the right stuff. Whereas we had other people in the group who were just loving this sort of, this freedom, this different way of working and working actively. And interestingly, given, as I said earlier, this notion about sort of Confucian heritage learners, it was quite a few, not all, but quite a few of the Chinese students who were really up for doing different things and working collaboratively and working in very sort of active kind of ways. The second cycle, we actually, purely by chance, fell into actually analysing the notion of critical student voice and co-constructing learning. And what actually happened there, we decided, on a bit of a whim actually, to focus the first session in that cycle on a study skills session. They had their first assignment coming up and they had to start engaging and planning for their first assignment. They were obviously very anxious about it. And Vassal taught a session on study skills. But rather than sort of developing it and then rushing in, we actually convened a group of about 6 or 7 of them before we started planning it. So we said, what do you want? What do you need? How do you want to do it? And actually, it only lasted 15 minutes. But it was actually engaging them about, what exactly is it that you need from this session to help you write your assignment, rather than just assumptions. And again, I'll talk about it in a few minutes, but certainly, one of the conversations we had is that actually the assumptions that we make about what they need aren't always accurate. And actually getting their insight is an extremely useful sort of process to go through. I then followed that through with a session on globalisation of education, so it's more sort of back to sort of content-based work, but again sitting down with a group and sort of asking them what kind of things they felt would be useful. Both of those first 2 cycles with the whole cohort is a core unit on contemporary issues in education. The third cycle was with a pedagogy group, a specialist pathway. There were only 10 of them rather than 26. And really, in a sense, we didn't try and take on a new big feature. We were just trying to implant and mature off some of the insights that we had had from the first 2 cycles to really create a pedagogy that seemed to work for the group. And Vassal did a session on curriculum studies and I did one on neuroscience and learning, which was quite challenging actually because it is pretty technical, and for second language learners all of the jargon that goes with neuroscience isn't necessarily obvious.
I'm basically dead in neuroscience.
Well, I mean, if we're honest, there's probably a lot of native speakers who don't know it. But if you're doing that in your second language as well, yeah.
Mike, jump ahead. Are you going to talk some more about the co-constructing?
Yeah, I'm gonna. What I'm gonna do is look through these 4 things. Okay, so there's that word again, because I'm a complexity theorist. Basically, what we've done, what we've learnt, hasn't been through a predetermined set of ideas. What we've done is we've started from a position where we think this is important, but we've actually just followed our noses. We've taken the insights that we've gained after each lesson and just tweaked and changed and moved in different directions that perhaps we didn't expect to take, just as we saw it in front of us to try and improve their learning. So I think the sort of main things that we've started to think about, the 4 things that we've taken from this, is obviously the process of lesson study itself. Talk a little bit about that. What some of those successful pedagogies are within this sort of environment of working with international students. What kind of pedagogies seem to work? What kind of insights have we got to try and make their learning better? And that includes that co-construction idea. But also, we've talked a lot about our own professional identities and how us as teachers have actually changed. In some ways, quite a lot, I think, because we have, through those insights, just started to really change, I think, the way that we think about some of the things that we do. And then finally, just the last slide is this idea of swimming in questions. One of the things that we found as we've gone through this is we probably ended up with more questions than answers, which is always good. But I've got to say, I think some of the questions that we have come up with, certainly in my case, some of those questions that I think are important have actually come from having a really good understanding of pedagogy in schools. With both of us both having taught in schools, then teaching within an HE environment, it is very, very different, but actually there's some really interesting differences and things that sort of you take for granted in one sphere that don't happen in another. And therefore, I think that's where some of those questions have come from, and more about that in a bit. Okay, process of lesson study. As Basil said before, I think one of the things that I think has happened very much is just this whole idea of refocusing onto learning. When I've developed stuff in the past, it's always been about, you know, what activities am I going to use, what order am I going to put them in, how's this going to play out, but not really in a lot of detail thought about the learning. And I suppose sort of one of the elements I haven't put on here that I should have put on is just, it was alluded to earlier on, just the opportunity in an HE setting to sit in a room with somebody else and talk about teaching and learning. Because it just doesn't happen. Not in any kind of structured way. And I can remember sort of in an early meeting that there was actually, it is on a transcript somewhere, there was a comment, I think by Basil, sort of saying, you know, laughed and then sort of saying, people would think we're mad. You know, taking all this time to talk about teaching and learning. People would think we're potty. Because actually, in the wider HE field, my experience is that just isn't part of the gig. That just isn't part of what we do. You know, I've got my lectures, I've got my seminars, I'll prepare for them and I'll go and deliver them, and what anybody else is doing isn't really just a part of the culture. One of the other things about session planning that I thought was really interesting was the context. So in cycle 1, for example, one session was brand new in many ways. We were taking a very, very different approach to it. And therefore, when you look at the transcript, it makes sense in its own right. There's a lot of discussion about learning, there's a lot of discussion really about the kind of things we're going to do and how it relates. When we did the effective teaching that Basil did, it was, if you like, a rehashing of an old session. So actually the transcript without the PowerPoint doesn't really make a lot of sense, because it's us pointing at a screen, so we could move that about, we could do this. So the whole dialogue, the discussion that we were having about learning was completely different. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that the actual discussion about learning is very much context driven, about the kind of resources you've got with you, whether you're altering things or starting anew. You do get very, very different kinds of discussions beginning to be creative. Yeah.
Thinking about, we were talking about asking students what they wanted from sessions, and that places a really high cognitive demand on them. So with the Teach First group, we've tried to be responsive to their needs and say, this is the general focus for a session in 2 months' time. You tell us what you think you need from this. These are the sorts of aims we've got. Yeah. Tell us what you want to learn, what in terms of content, what in terms of pedagogy. Give us some ideas. And actually, one of our students came up with the idea of the unknown unknowns. He said, I'm not at the point to be able to know really what I don't know about this yet. Yeah. And it's been really hard for them to tell us in advance. Retrospectively, they said, oh, I wish we'd have done this and that thing now fits in. But I think actually it's quite hard for students to be part of that planning process because of the unknown unknowns and because the opposite side of it.
I mean, I'll mention it later, but for us, where we've done those 2 sessions where we had input from them, it was like a week before. So actually, there was far more, I guess part of it could be that there's far more context around what it was they were going to do as they were approaching it. So they weren't, if you like, they weren't approaching it cold in that kind of way. I think the other thing that we'd obviously fostered, again, I'll talk about it more in a minute, but all of the first 6 sessions of contemporary issues, we were both in here, either doing formal observations or just sort of seeing what each other were doing, and you know, because so the students had sort of, we'd already started this sort of almost informal discussion, I suppose, about curriculum and learning and teaching with them as part of their own learning, but also just part of that evolving community. And I think that's where that sort of that informal, that almost undefinable part of it becomes really quite important. They thought it was bizarre that there were 2 of us in the room at one time. They couldn't cope with it. 1 or 2 of them. They thought it was really, really weird. And thought we were weird for both being in the same room at the same time. The other thing that sort of comes through, and this has happened across all of the projects, but certainly is a focal point in the planning that we've been doing, is the importance of rehearsal. What we found is that playing with this idea of a column for teaching and a column for learning is that once you've got teaching in place, by doing the learning part, what you're actually doing is just going through cycles and cycles and cycles of rehearsal together. Okay, what's this going to look like? So there's a quote here. We've asked them to look at 5 things. We've asked them to go through the questions. Then we sort of say, right, having had the questions answered, go back together with the 5 things that you noticed, etc. So we're constantly, a large proportion of those planning meetings are us rehearsing, what kind of questions we're going to ask, what we're going to be doing, how it's all going to fit together. And it does become, I think, quite a signature of a lot of planning discussions, both within this project and other projects we've been involved in, this central element of rehearsal. And understanding how people are going to react and feeding through and thinking through how this is actually going to happen. Obviously, through doing the planning in the way, and I've in your packs we put you a sort of a blank one without all of the observation notes on for one session. And that's the neuroscience section, if I remember rightly. Yeah. This was sort of the basic sort of way that we were working. I think what this does is, and of central importance, is linking teaching and learning. We've done it in the ITE project as well, with student teachers, and some of the feedback we've had from there has been really positive because it's forcing them to put the learner at the centre of the discussion. And by having that column, that forces that. So we were having really, really fantastic discussions, the like I've never had before. I mean, I've been on and off in various ways. I've been researching and learning for the best part of a decade. And I would have said in the last 18 months working with Vassal on our own practice particularly, but also with the other projects, I've probably learned more about learning in the last 18 months compared to the previous 8.5 years, if I'm honest. Because you just end up getting into such a deep discussion about both teaching and learning and how they link. And what's really fantastic from my point of view is the idea that there are professional differences. We see the world in very different ways at times when it comes to teaching and learning. I'm quite happy to sort of admit that I'm sort of very free-form kind of teacher. I've got a really good idea of where I'm starting and where I want to end, but what happens in between those 2 points is is up for grabs, especially since I've gone into ITE. Because I don't have sort of senior management breathing down the net asking for ridiculously large amounts of lesson planning. But Vassal is more didactic. But actually what's happened is through having that difference, it's been a brilliant catalyst for debate and discussion and development of the way that I see teaching and learning. And my views of teaching and learning have changed. And interestingly, as a result, because my views have changed, it's also changed the way that I've taught people about teaching and learning, especially at PGCE level. And actually, the kind of feedback I'm getting this year is that it's really had a positive impact. Not only those involved in our research, but more widely, who seem to have a better idea of teaching and learning themselves. In terms of the observation, I would have said this has been the largest and steepest learning curve for both of us. Learning to observe students, learning to observe learning is incredibly difficult to begin with. The first time I did it on a 2-hour session in Masters, I had a headache by the end of it. Because you're just getting so immersed in it, the level of concentration required to watch 2 people is really difficult. It's culturally difficult. Having been an AST for 5 years in the secondary school, being on an observation team, sitting in the back of rooms, watching teachers, sort of watching the kids, but they were almost incidental from time to time. Sort of all of that kind of culture, and that's a culture that I'll admit I retained into ITE, because that's the culture I came from. Suddenly putting a break on that and doing something very, very different is actually quite disorientating. It's actually quite difficult. But it gives you a huge amount of insight. And those insights come as much from the things you don't see as the things you do see. And I would say very much that observation does give incomplete stories. I don't know how much Vassal would agree with me on this one, but I would actually say Ofsted's wasting their time. If Ofsted go into a lesson for 20 minutes and observe 30 kids, they're wasting their time. Because actually anything they say in terms of what those kids are learning is trite, as far as I'm concerned. And that comes from an engagement with trying to understand learning from just observing two people. Because what does learning look like? People learning different ways. The effective teaching session was really instructive on this one. I observed two students, one of whom was busy, noting down on about 4 different pieces of paper, highlighting, taking photographs, looking things up on iPhones, listening to what Vassal was saying. She was so busy it was unreal. And when I did the stimulated recall interview with her afterwards, I pretty much got spot on how she was learning. I pretty much understood from the observation how she was going through her process of learning. The other student I was watching, in classic Ofsted terms, would have been totally disengaged. You're at best of 3, possibly of 4. That individual wasted 2 hours of their life. Because she sat there, staring into space, didn't even really look at the interactive whiteboard, sat there, didn't really do a lot. Once in a while, I think over a 2-hour period, she underlined or highlighted 7 words. That was it. And I was sort of sitting there thinking, oh, this is going to be an interesting evaluation. He's dying on his feet here, so she just isn't linking into this at all. When I did the stimulated recall interview, what she didn't know about that session wasn't worth knowing. And when I started talking to her, what was happening was, well, I've taught. I am a teacher. So as he's introducing new ideas, what I'm doing is filtering them through and either linking them into stuff I already know, or saying, no, that won't work for me, chuck that out. Or on those 6 or 7 periods when there's a real nugget or something I don't understand, I'll underline or highlight the word, and then I'll go off and research it afterwards. So she got a huge amount from the session, but sitting there as an observer, I'm thinking, right, okay, yeah, we're going to have to think about this one again. So, observation is crucial, but it doesn't give us everything.
You see that in young children as well. A lot of people watching in the classrooms, even with really small children, the teachers themselves will think, oh, he's spinning around at the back there, paying attention. Actually, the spinning around at the back means you can focus better on what you're doing, but there is a mismatch between what we think we're looking at and what's actually happening.
And it comes back to this idea of what's learning, and how do we see it, and how do we know it.
How do we judge it, assess it?
So, in terms of evaluating learning and thinking about the evaluation in lesson study, I would have said that really the interviews are crucial.
Yeah.
Formal Japanese lesson study doesn't make use of interviewing, and they obviously get a great deal from what they're doing. And I wasn't sceptical of interviewing when we first started, but I was sort of thinking, well, how much does it really add? Why can't we just use observation? But very rapidly I've come around to the idea that actually if you don't use the pairing together, if you don't use the interviewing and the observation and their work, using the artefacts of what they've produced, because if you're doing stimulated recall, that's the in on their cognitive. What were they thinking? How were they making sense of it? Then, you're not going to get anything like a decent picture. And what that has really done is just, I'd already thought this, I've already sort of drafted and written about this, but it really just reiterates that, so just that sheer complexity of learning. And to actually trying to understand learning is a highly complex task. And obviously within evaluation meetings, just having that time to sit down and reflect on our own practice What have we learned? Where are we going next? What did work well and why did it work well? Just having that time where you feel it's legitimately used time, rather than feeling that you should be going and, feeding in data somewhere or do some kind of onerous admin task because actually that needs to be done by tomorrow. Ring-fencing that time for that professional dialogue was incredibly important. So I think one of the two main things for the project that I think are real outcomes as far as I'm concerned is, first of all, this idea of collaborative working, which I think at a key level is even more uncommon than in schools, far more uncommon, but essential. And secondly, that idea of observing and discussing with students about their learning. And I think, again, as Glasgow said, it's not that lesson study is unique in enabling that to happen, but actually it's a really good framework for it. Okay, so developing pedagogies. 4 things I want to pick up on here quite briefly. What type of learning with students? The idea of learning ecologies, not seeing learning as something that happens in a room for 2 hours, but actually how does it operate in conjunction with that 2 hours around it. The whole issue of language, especially with students that we've been working with, and then this idea of co-construction of learning. Student perceptions of their own learning. As I sort of alluded to earlier, there's a really interesting dynamic with a very diverse group such as we're working with around student and tutor roles. What is the role of the student? What is the role of the tutor? What should I be doing within a session? What is it my responsibility to do? And alongside that, this idea of sort of either instrumental learning, is learning just about us coming in, filling them up with facts, which is what some of them want. They just want to come in, us to give them all the stuff, give them all of the knowledge, and then they can go away again. Or discovery learning. And I think there's an uneasy dynamic there, because I think even those who do get more into that sort of discovery type learning are never totally happy with it, and feel as if they want some of the more traditional didactic stuff, which is fine. I'm not sort of saying that we should be imprinting one particular approach. In fact, I think one of the strengths of this has been that we've tried lots of different things out, and that variety actually is probably one thing to come out of it. But having that variety in approaches is what's most important. We've got a Turkish student here. I think group, sometimes a very good idea, but sometimes it's not good. I think because some people have more responsibilities than other students. I think some students they more manage to process, but some students can be quite shy. He was very reticent about any kind of group work, any kind of social learning. What he wanted was to come in and to work individually. He didn't mind if you were going to give him a card sort individually. He didn't mind if it was going to be listening to somebody talk individually. But what he was really quite insecure about was that idea of wider group work, and part of that was a language issue. And sometimes, not always, but with some of them, part of the problem with group work is a language issue. They're not necessarily confident, especially if you've got a group of, say, 4 people, within which you might have 2 or 3 different first languages, and they're all using English as a second language. Whereas Chinese student in master's degree studies should have focus on some research and cooperation with each other to find the best way to solve problems. So I think it's quite good. It's better than someone do the work by themselves. So within the same group, you've got these sort of very, very different views about what they want from their learning and how they feel they're going to be successful in their learning. And certainly the first student, the Turkish student, it was almost a case of, well, yeah, it was okay doing all that group work with teaching, with learning theories, but I'd come across some of it before. Yeah, I was wasting my time. It was all nice and flowery, and it was all nice and interactive, and it was lovely watching bits of video. But I already had some of those hard facts, and I just needed other hard facts. And why were you wasting my time? Whereas the other student was very much a case. It was great being able to interact and discuss. However, the other interesting element of that, he's taught. He was actually a primary school teacher for a while before he came to the course, and therefore feels that he already knows all of that stuff. He doesn't need to revisit it. She hasn't taught before. She's come straight from a degree. So of course a lot of the content was far newer to her. So there's an innate, trying to create this learning community that is useful for everyone. There's that sort of innate tension in there of lots of different wants and preferences. And obviously at a master's level, what you're trying to do is give everybody some of, the preferred way of working. So one of the things I think we've sort of come to is the idea that you do have to just basically create whatever pedagogy you think is best for a particular body of knowledge, and some of that might be more active, some of it might be more didactic. It's not a case of just using one or the other, and therefore, I've seen a lot of debate recently on Twitter about, are you a progressive teacher, and if you're a progressive educationalist, you're next to Satan, and you ought to just be sort of doing loads of transmission stuff, and that's all, didactic teaching is the best. It just seems to me such a puerile argument. Sort of basically what you should be doing is sort of say, what are my learning intentions? It isn't always about knowledge, there's other things you might want to be learning, and therefore you create whatever's going to be most useful. The other thing that we have done in the past that we really worked hard on this time round was the whole idea of learning ecologies, not seeing a session as being a session by itself. So one of the things that we've done is worked a lot on pre-sessional material. And I think in the past it's fair to say that pre-session has tended to be email them a paper, tell them to read it, and then bring whatever they've got from it to the session. What we've had really, really positive feedback on from students is giving them a paper for sort of saying, actually just read these 5 pages and actually have a go at these 2 or 3 tasks. So that actually the tasks are very, very focused, and we're asking them to really home in on particular issues or particular concepts. And on 1 or 2 occasions it's been really quite heavily frameworked. What we haven't done is just sort of said read a paper or read this chapter out of a book. And one of the things that we found is that they have found that really, really useful. It's been extremely popular, and obviously we don't take homework or anything like that, but our feeling, I think, is that the vast majority of people are doing that and engaging with it. And even our student there who wanted quite a traditional approach within the classroom was very, very positive about those pre-sessional activities. It hasn't always been reading. The learning theory session that we did was actually a narrated narrated PowerPoint. And they just watched it for half an hour, and then came in with that into the session. And we gave them some session notes as well. I've already covered on this other one huge differences in learning during sessions. That actually the way that students engage with learning whilst they're in sessions are very, very different. Some of them are using lots of technology, some of them aren't. There was a really interesting example in the session I did on neuroscience, where I was talking about sort of emotions and characteristics. I was talking about a famous example in America in the 19th century of a railway worker, Gage I think his name was, who was packing down explosives with a rod, as you do, and it blew up in his face, and the rod went straight up behind his jaw and out through the top of his head and took most of his prefrontal cortex with it. And there's a lot of evidence that before this happened he was an upstanding member of the Methodist Church, and he'd taken the pledge and he was an upstanding member of society, and after it had taken off the front of his brain with it, he became sort of really nasty individual, and he was constantly drinking, and it's a classic example of how sort of changes in sort of the brain effectively can change how somebody acts. Literally within 15 seconds of mentioning this example, there was one of them on a tablet onto Google, Googling it and finding out. There was another one on a netbook doing exactly the same. And, students are learning in lots and lots of different ways. And therefore, I think, again, one of the insights we got from doing this is that we have to try, as we're developing the ideas for lessons, to keep as inclusive a classroom as possible, but inclusive in terms of allowing different ways of people being able to hook into that learning. And not getting really uppity if they're not learning in exactly the way that we expect them to. And not, for example, it would have been very easy for me to stop at that point and say, come on you three, look at me, listen, because you're all off on your tablets. They were learning. They were learning what they thought was important at that point. So just this idea of different ways of learning. This is that student who didn't seem to be doing a great deal. Okay, so Vassal interviewed them. Have you got notes on the slides? No. Just a small number, underline some things on your slides. Yep. So you've got the slides here, and occasionally throw just the odd word. Because it's not the first language, it's a little bit difficult to listen, translate and write, so I just listen to understand. Whereas an English-speaking student, it's funny, this is the one who had about 15 pieces of paper on the go, it's funny because I listen a lot to him, both of you, and I like Vassal, because actually I like it that he uses a lot of anecdotes, and I kind of like him because I phase out, because he's talking, and then I just look at the points, and then I'll try, and it's like listening for specific information. It's like I'm sort of not completely ignoring him, but I'm sort of waiting for him to pull out something that I'm like, I don't know that, or like I'm like, oh. So I listen to him, but if he's talking or he said something that I find especially interesting, then I might look it up on my phone like quickly. So he's just phasing in and out of what Vassal's saying. And if he's saying something useful, she'll listen. If he goes into an anecdote or a bit she already understands, if she can utilise the time better for the next 30 seconds, she'll go and do that. And she'll use a phone. She had a phone, a laptop, and about 4 different pieces of paper on the desk. And it was like watching somebody playing bingo. I mean, so the pen and the highlighter were all over the place. So it's beginning to understand that complexity that's going on. And also within the idea of learning technology is the use of technology. We have lots of different technology going on. Some of them have tablets, some of them use iPhones, netbooks, laptops. They're all using them in different ways. And one of the things that I found fascinating from a sort of technology and language point of view was I was interviewing one student in Cycle 3, and I hadn't really realised that they were doing it so proactively. Some words, especially the academic words, I need to refer to a dictionary, so I bring an electronic dictionary everywhere. That is a screen grab of her, I think it's a tablet, if I remember rightly, it's a Samsung tablet. What she actually does, and what she has done over the course of the year, as have 2 or 3 other people in the group, they've created their own glossaries of terms. So every session, when they go in, either pre-sessional reading or work they're doing, and in the session, if there's words that they think are important that they don't understand, they're highlighting them, they're going home, they're looking them up, they're understanding them, and then they're creating their own personal glossary of terms. And they're bringing them to sessions, which I just think is absolutely, I mean, we've never suggested it, we've never talked about it, they have just done that as something for them individually to facilitate their own learning, which I just think is wonderful. I wonder to what extent, and I don't know how you would do it, whether they'd buy in, I don't know to what extent they are so personalised that they couldn't pull those resources. Because actually if they pulled those resources into bigger glossaries with more terms, it might actually be a distraction, because they might have stuff that they don't want. But just understanding how they're doing that. And I've got to say before we move on, again, I know Vassal sort of mentioned this earlier on, I will never forget the pilot last year. He had spent 3 years being on the verge of telling people off in sessions for getting their phones out and texting. And then he was doing an observation and realised that what they were doing a session where we asked them to design a classroom. And we'd been and done observations in primary schools the week before, and about 4 of them got their iPhones out and they were just flicking through photographs from the primary schools they'd been in to inform the designs that they were creating. For 3 years, Vassal had been assuming they'd been texted, and they were ignoring it. So, just in terms of that sort of impromptu use of technology, it's huge. They're using it all the time. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, Just very quickly about language. I've mentioned some of this already. Obviously there's an innate variability. And one of the problems that we've got, obviously, is trying to make sure that everybody has a strong enough grasp of the language to really be able to sort of move forward and sort of grasp and grapple with what we're asking them to do. And one way that we've sort of started to facilitate, I'll put an example in here. There's actually, this was a pre-sessional reading, and I've deliberately made it very, very short before the neuroscience session. And it's just a quick introduction to the brain. But what I actually did there deliberately was to highlight any term that I thought might be important in the session. And I actually said to them, right, here's an introduction, it's deliberately short, but as you're going through some of those highlighted words and ones that we're going to be using that are quite central to the session, if you're not sure, actually use your time to look those up. And some of them, when they came into the session, it was obvious from some of the annotations on their paper, from some of the things that they were saying, that that's exactly what they'd done. They'd gone away, and where there was quite technical information, they'd gone away and they'd actually thought about it and done a bit of research so that they came understanding some of that technical vocabulary. And as a consequence, I can't be certain because you can't measure it, but I'm pretty sure that that actually helped the session go far more smoothly, because it meant that they were engaged with the discussion rather than us constantly trying to bring that sort of basic foundational vocabulary up to speed. Student-led glossaries I've mentioned, also terminology, which is what I just said. Co-construction. The way that it worked in the work we've done here was really, as we said before, to about a week before each of the two sessions to actually convene a group and actually say to them, you know, we've got this session coming up, and the study skills one is probably the best example of the two. What is it that you're unsure of? What is it you're anxious about in terms of your first assignment? And they gave us a list of things that they felt they needed to go through. And then Vassal sort of started to sort of, well, are you saying that this would be useful, that would be useful, what order might you put them in, what kind of exercises would you like, what do you think would be useful to use? So that over a quarter of an hour, we started to get really quite a decent idea of what the stumbling blocks were for them. And this is just part of the transcript from that. So I'm not sure exactly the difference between the introduction and the conclusion. Some introduction would need to describe some background information about our main topic, but in conclusion would also mean that. So what's exactly the difference between them? And how to write down the conclusion, which I need to write a summary or something, the other I'm not sure. So we could sort of get a notion very quickly about issues about essay structure, about what kind of things we wanted them to include. There were issues around referencing. And the main thing, I think, if I remember rightly, was this idea of critical writing. What does critical writing actually look like, and how do you do it?
It's really hard, I think.
It's phenomenally hard. And as a result, I think we came up with 4 activities, I think, three. And what was really interesting was we got through them just in the 2 hours, and then we actually convened the group directly afterwards and sort of said, did it cover what you wanted? How did it go? What do you think? And, you know, it was a case of, well, it was a bit rushed in places and we would have liked more time to do this, that, and the other, but actually all of the activities were really, really useful. So we were getting some really interesting, useful feedback about whether or not it was doing exactly what they needed.
Yeah, I mean, I challenged them on that because they said, they can I just say, that the session existed before. I'd taught this for years. I was told every time I was asked to do it. Now, I said, well, why am I being asked to do this? Oh, you're good at it. It's absolute rubbish, really, because the session existed and I thought I was addressing needs. In fact, the agenda they gave us meant, I mean, it was a 2-day preparation phase to get the new session ready. And then we challenged them when they said, well, we didn't finish any one of the 3 things. I said, okay, well, which one do we leave out then in future? And they said, no. I said, because they were following things. I said, no, we can follow it up. No. it's better to have something about each one of them. So I suppose the answer would be you should have 3 hours. But I don't think I've covered. But it was interesting that they totally transformed the session from something that was long established into something experimental. But I don't think we could go back to the old pattern. That's where there's a real effect on teaching, I think.
Yeah.
Does that answer the...
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I then did a session on globalisation in education, and again, I sort of said to them, you know, what would be useful? You know, this is what I've done in the past, what would be useful? And they actually sort of said, it would be really nice to find out about how lots of countries are, for, you know, what their education systems look like and how they're reacting to globalisation. And therefore, I've gone from what previously had actually been quite a dry session to one that was using sort of expert group work, and they were looking at different countries and they were placing them along a sort of a germ spectrum using Pasi Sahlberg stuff on, you know, sort of global educational reform movement. And are these sort of very much sort of almost neoliberal systems, or are they more about sort of social equality and far higher level of thinking? But they were sort of saying things like, we haven't really used any data. We'd like some simple data to look at, so that we you know, we've got some numbers. We'd like to look at different countries. So they didn't give us a really strict outline, but what they did do is give us a lot of different threads that we could then begin to play around with and put together to actually decide, you know, what this session might actually look like. And therefore, certainly this coming year, when we hope to do some more of this, that co-construction with students will just be a core part of what we do. You know, I don't think we've got to a stage now where it would almost seem incomplete not to include that. It's 15 minutes. You know, these weren't massively long meetings with, you know, shed loads of coffee coming in to keep everybody going. This was 15 minutes. But actually the insights we got were incredibly useful. And whilst on the study skills session it meant the planning was longer, the planning session to plan the session wasn't longer, it was the resource production that was longer. Actually, our meetings for those 2 lessons to plan the sessions were shorter, because actually we had a load of really good ideas to go on to begin with. So where lesson study can be a problem, as is being put on, you know, the amount of time required to do it, you know, you might be spending 2-3 hours to plan a lesson. I would suggest that one way that we might begin to cut down on the amount of time we need is actually by using that co-construction and actually talking with kids, because then they speed the rest of your planning up. Penultimate thing, nearly finished. Professional insights and identities. As I've sort of said all the way through, and I think it's a big feature of lesson study, it has changed the way we view learning, without a shadow of a doubt. And it's changed in terms of structure. As I said before, I've become less sort of free form. I feel a lot happier now, actually, and more relaxed with actually having a very clear framework. There might be a lot of sort of fairly loose stuff within that framework, but I do have a framework, which is different. Vasil is now, by his own admission, doing lots of things that he probably hasn't done in the past, and again feeling more confident about it. So, you know, we have changed our view of learning and structures. We've both certainly changed our view of technology, and not only the utility, but, you know, how to embed it. And that perhaps the embedding of technology, certainly with our master students, isn't necessarily about us leading it, it's about us facilitating it. You know, it's about us allowing what already happens to happen, but then perhaps just prodding in various directions to see if there's any other ways in which we can accommodate it or get them to use things. I mean, it's not from these master students, but one example where I think it demonstrates you can't force technology use. Right at the start of the year on the teacher training course, I do a session for an hour and a half, an observation, classroom observation. Now I went in thinking, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to put a Twitter hashtag up, and I'm going to say to them, you know, I've got TweetDeck up on the computer, and as we go through, if you've got any questions or views or insights, because we're in this horrible bank of physics lecture theatre, and therefore you can't talk to each other very easily, you know, if you've got anything, you know, stick that hashtag on the end and I'll reply to you live as we go through. We'll stop the session a couple of times. It's an interesting question, we'll have a bit of a discussion. And I sort of went in thinking this is going to be great. I used Prezi rather than PowerPoint, which I do for that deliberately just to give them an alternative, to show them there are alternative ways of doing things. I know half the people tend to end up feeling seasick, but okay, I do it for that purpose really, just to give them a different thing. I had one tweet in an hour and a half. And that one tweet was, "That's a great package, what is it?" And that was nothing to do with the learning whatsoever. And you know, in a sense I shouldn't have been surprised. I hadn't sort of developed a rapport with them, I hadn't developed that way of working. But I think it demonstrates that you can't force technology. You can't use it in an unnatural, you know, in an unnatural kind of way. It has to be something that grows as part of that community.
But that's a bit like Basil at the beginning was talking about cultures, different cultures.
Yeah.
Culturally, that's alien to us to be allowed to use technology
Yeah.
in our learning.
Yeah.
Whereas elsewhere in Europe, it would be seen as the students would be, I mean, school-age students would be using technology rather than engaging with the teacher necessarily, and they use them in exams as well. So it's not, you know, it's a cultural difference in terms.
And it's about building that community and that
It is,
rapport.
yeah,
I like the word
yeah.
learning in that sense.
And then the other thing I suppose for us, certainly I found it interesting, is just our identity amongst the students in lots of different ways. Outside of this project, I remember talking to a Saudi Arabian student last year who actually said at the age of 27 it was the first time that she'd ever been in the seminar room with a male teacher, not by video. But actually in the learning that they do back in Saudi Arabia, a man is not allowed to teach face-to-face with a classroom of women. It's just not allowed. So it was quite a cultural shock to her to actually have sort of, you know, people like us just sort of breezing in, you know, hi folks, you know, let's do some learning. Very, very culturally different. But also that identity of us as teachers and the way that we work, and probably to some students seem quite informal in the way that we operate. And that's all stuff that they have to sort of get used to. This Turkish student, I think yesterday or last week, I don't know why, because in my country some teacher is very worried about the other teacher in the lesson. And he was really quite bowled over about this whole notion that there might be two people, and that I might be in a room while Vassal's teaching, and he's not worried about the fact that I'm in there. So there's a lot of sort of just those ideas about, well, how do we navigate that? How do we, within this evolving sort of community of learning that we're trying to create, how do we actually navigate those kinds of things that we've never really thought about, that have actually come out through some of the stuff that we've been doing with this? So I think we've learned a great deal. I think we've gained a lot of ideas, a lot of insight, but there have been some really big questions along the way. Some of which we sort of mentioned before, one certainly we haven't. And these are just sort of some of these questions that I think was really. I'll put the onion up there because I think it's a really nice analogy for the idea that, you know, you start off with it and you start stripping some of the layers away, and there's always layers below, and you never sort of really get to the nub of it in a sense. First of all, one of the things that we did have a discussion about, and we're undecided, we are genuinely undecided about this. Differentiation is right at the heart of every kind of conversation you get in schools. How do we differentiate people's learning? How do we get all the kids to learn at their potential by differentiating tasks, by differentiating in lots of different ways? I have never ever heard a discussion about differentiation at HE level.
When I work on a PG cert in academic practice, and it's my real bugbear, and every time I go in and talk and sit in on practice lessons, I say, how will you attract learning, and you know, how will you recognise the talented people in your cohort of students, and what do you do about it? That's what I'm doing like everything on, like supervising. But it really, really exercises me, it fascinates me, and it is literally as if I've kind of released an unknown word into the room, even with quite experienced tutors, and they're trying to redesign it at the moment, and that's the thing I'm sort of wanting people to look at more, actually look at all.
But then, what was really interesting in an international context the discussion we then started having was, actually, if we did start to try and differentiate, and we were giving out, say, different resources, would they actually feel offended?
I think it doesn't fit their culture.
So, we're not saying that we shouldn't, but we think there are major question marks about how you would make it work positively. You know, if you've got people whose belief of learning is that it's for them to deal with, it's them to grapple with, it's them to understand, you're just delivering something, you're sort of saying, well, actually, I don't think you're, you know, in the way we're doing this, we don't think you're going to cope with this in quite the same way. Here, have this, but we're going to give these people over here that. I can think of several people we've been working with this year who sort of say, hang on, go away, give me what they're having. You know, I'll struggle with it, I'll make sense of it. So we're not sort of saying that we shouldn't differentiate, but I think there's a genuine debate at HE level to be had about what it looks like, how we do it, how we make it something that is positive rather than seen as being something that is stigmatising people. I still don't think we got to the centre of the whole issue of the role of culture. Both in terms of larger scale cultures that they're coming from, but also the culture that we're developing as a learning community. Because so much of it is intangible. And I think we would both say that that's something that we still feel that we need to do a huge amount of work on, is how do you consciously begin to create a community of learners? How do you begin to create a culture for people to work within? Obviously, as we've said loads of times now, really, the big question around observation. What is it we're observing? How are we observing? How are we going to get the maximum out of that? The fact that when we've done, for two of the sessions, we actually had a third member come in. Raphael, who's one of the PhD students in the department, came in because he was doing some of the sessions on that pedagogy course. So we invited him along, so I said, come and do it. You know, you might be useful for your own development as a teacher. Might not, you don't have to, but you know, come along if you want to. What was really interesting is that elements of the observations that we did fitted together, others didn't. Still being in the same room with the same lesson. So it demonstrates that it is through a lens and is partial. And then obviously the big one that I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of, and I'll talk about it a little bit more this afternoon, is the whole idea of learning. We still have massive question marks over not necessarily what are they learning, but certainly how are they learning. The students. Yeah. How are they learning? What's the process that they're going through at any particular point in time? The one consistent that's come through in post-session interviews that they mention time after time after time is the importance of prior learning. And I've had several of them really in very erudite fashion actually talk about the idea that in any session when they're learning something new, they are learning it in relation to their prior learning. And they're very, very clear about that. It's the only constant that we've had all the way through.
But that in itself is differentiation.
It is, but again, it's that idea of you probably don't have a very good idea, from such a diverse group, you probably don't have a very good idea of what their individual prior learning is, and therefore, how do you create sessions
But that's
that are facilitating everyone?
The co-construction is very important for that.
Yeah.
So the co-construction is directly related to differentiation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, I think the scaffolding of the pre-session tasks.
Yeah, of course.
I think the fact that we've been influenced by this view that we have, with the preparation that we did for each session, and the level to which it was tangible. Because in the past we said, read this paper and be prepared to discuss it. That's simply not good enough. Not with the students we have.
So I suppose we've got to a position where we feel that we've got a great deal from this. I certainly feel that I understand them better, far better as learners than any of the previous years when I've been involved in Masters teaching. I feel that we have, because of the amount of time we put in with them, I also feel that we've had a lot higher, sort of almost meta-level discussions about learning with them. There's a far richer discussion about learning as a process that they almost now see as part of that learning community that has been created. So there's a huge amount in here that we've learned in lots of different ways. But I would say that we are still at the position where probably the majority of the time we are still scratching our heads. And I think the reason for that is that the really fantastic thing about lesson study is that by opening up such a deep level of analysis where you begin to understand things more, you also begin to realise that there's a whole stack more stuff that you still haven't got a clue about, that you never ever really even thought about in the past. It's great. I mean, as long as you live with that fuzziness, what I think it begins, and this is where I would argue this whole notion of scholarship and teaching and learning in HE is important. Because what it begins to do is to suggest that, you know, I don't know, I think things are changing in some places, but I think there's still a belief that teaching and learning is an inherently easy thing and simple thing. And what I think this does, and again I'm not suggesting it's the only thing that does it, what this really begins to do is to open up the complexity of teaching and learning, and therefore why the scholarship of teaching and learning in HE is so incredibly important and very useful, very important in its own right as a research area. And yet, interestingly, if I look on the HEA website, if I look, I mean, they've asked me to review grant bids for them in the past. It seems to me that the majority of projects, the majority of applications are actually from post-92s, where teaching and learning perhaps in many ways is more central to what they're doing. A lot of the sort of red bricks, a lot of the sort of those kinds of universities, I think it's still seen as being the kind of thing that you do on your weekend, or, you know, it's sort of second best. If I need something else for the ref, I might bung out a quick paper about teaching and learning in my area. It's not seen as being that sort of really deep academic pursuit, which it is. And I, more than ever before, I'm absolutely convinced of that, having done this.
We should just say, the final thing is, that I want to say is that I want to make clear that we've done all this in a module called Contemporary Issues in Education. That's a module which we work on together. We work on a couple of, most of the sessions have been focused on that. And these are the best results we've had. And we can't prove a correlation, but they are significantly better. I mean, we normally have people, because they, you know, come from all sorts of different backgrounds. You know, we normally have a number of people struggling. We haven't, and we've got very high scores. Can't prove the correlation, but it's uncanny that just the difference in previous years. You know, and if we were to see a pattern doing that every year, then we'd have to begin to look for why what's happening. And the levels are not, you know, the levels in their IELTS and their degrees and that kind, they're not dissimilar to what we had before. But the real results are markedly better.
And I think we've got more people this year applying for doctoral studies in various places, both here and elsewhere.
I mean, it could be a coincidence. We'd have to do that.